All right, so hey everyone, welcome back. We are diving deep today into something pretty specific, as usual. We're going to be looking at how the Philippines handles
Sure.
uh, giving extra pay to government employees
Hmm.
when they have to work the night shift.
Okay.
It might seem kind of niche at first, but I
Hmm.
think it's going to be pretty fascinating once we start thinking about all the little pieces involved.
Yeah.
There's the fairness aspect, making sure these folks are compensated for working those less desirable hours.
Right.
And then there's the question of how different types of jobs are treated. Are all government employees included in this? And we're going to get to see how laws actually get put into action.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you go from a general idea in a law to the nitty-gritty details of calculating someone's paycheck?
Yeah, it's like, how does it actually work on the ground?
Exactly. So to get into all this, we've got two main sources we're going to be looking at.
Okay.
First, we have the actual law itself, officially known as Republic Act number 1101, which was passed in 2022.
Got it.
And then we have the the super detailed rule book, on how to apply that law. And that came out in 2023 from the Civil Service Commission. So they're like the folks in charge of figuring out the rules and regulations for government employees.
Okay.
So between these two documents, we should be able to answer some pretty interesting questions like who exactly gets this extra pay for night shifts?
Mm-hmm.
How much are we talking about? And what happens if someone's shift goes longer than expected?
Right. Like, are there different rules for overtime on top of the night shift differential?
Yeah, exactly. So let's dive right in. Let's start with the law itself, Republic Act number 111001. At its core, this law is basically saying, hey, if you're a government worker in the Philippines and you're putting in those late night hours, you deserve a little something extra.
Yeah, and what's interesting here is that the law explicitly states it applies to both permanent government employees and those who are working on a temporary or contractual basis.
Oh, wow. So even if you're not a full-time, career government employee, you
Yeah.
still get this benefit.
That seems to be the intention. It suggests that the government is really trying to ensure fairness across the board for anyone working those less desirable hours.
I see. So it's not about your specific employment status. It's about recognizing that night work is, well, night work, no matter who's doing it.
Precisely.
That's pretty cool. But I'm noticing that the law doesn't just tell us who is eligible for this extra pay. It also lays out who isn't.
Yeah, and sometimes those exclusions can be just as insightful as the inclusions. Like, they can tell us a lot about the underlying logic of the policy.
Oh, okay. So what kind of folks are we talking about here? Who's left out of this night shift differential pay?
Well, for starters, government employees who work a regular daytime schedule, between the hours of 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., they're not eligible.
Well, yeah, that makes sense. The whole point is to compensate for working outside those normal hours, right?
Exactly. It wouldn't make much sense to give someone extra pay for working a typical 9 to 5.
Right.
And then they also exclude those in positions that, by their very nature, require 24/7 availability.
Like in Justice. So we're talking about military personnel, police officers, firefighters, folks like that.
Oh, yeah. I can see how that would be tricky. Trying to define a specific night shift for someone who's always on call, I'm guessing their compensation is handled differently, maybe through some other kind of system.
Right. Likely due to the unique nature of their work.
Okay, so we've got a sense of who's in and who's out. But for everyone else, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Like, how does this night shift differential pay actually work? How much are we talking about here?
Right. So to answer that, we need to turn to those detailed guidelines I mentioned earlier.
The ones from the Civil Service Commission.
Exactly. They put out this, rule book almost to explain how to implement the law.
Cool.
And one of the key things they do is define something called the hourly basic rate for each employee.
Okay, so that's like the starting point for figuring out their night shift pay.
Exactly. But it's not as simple as just dividing someone's monthly salary by the number of hours they work. There's a specific formula they use. Ah. So it's not just a straight percentage of your regular salary.
Not quite, and I think that's intentional, to ensure fairness regardless of someone's bank pay.
So how does this formula work?
Well, it takes into account things like the employee's salary grade, step increment, and any other applicable allowances or benefits.
Sounds complicated.
It can be, but the idea is to create a level playing field.
Right. So someone with a higher base salary isn't necessarily going to get a huge bonus just because they worked a night shift.
Right. It's all about that hourly basic rate.
Okay, I'm following so far. So
Okay.
once you have that hourly rate, How do you calculate the actual night shift differential pay?
Okay, so the law allows for up to 20% of that hourly basic rate to be added on as a differential.
Up to 20%. Okay.
But the exact percentage within that range, it's actually determined by the head of each government agency.
Oh, interesting. So each agency has some leeway in deciding how much extra they want to give their employees for working those late nights.
Right. There's some flexibility built into the system.
That makes sense. But I'm noticing here in the guidelines, there's a special rule for public health workers.
Yeah, you noticed that, huh?
Yeah.
The guidelines specifically state that for public health workers, like nurses, doctors, and other healthcare staff, they must receive at least 10% of their hourly basic rate as a night shift differential.
Oh, so there's a minimum for them.
Exactly. It seems like they're recognizing the crucial role of these workers, especially during those late night hours when hospitals need to be fully staffed.
Yeah, totally. You can't just have a skeleton crew at the hospital at 3 a.m., right? You need those folks to be alert and ready to go.
Precisely. And I think setting a minimum percentage for them is a way of acknowledging that.
That makes a lot of sense. But what about those situations where, like, someone's night shift goes longer than planned?
Ah, you're talking about overtime.
Yeah, like what happens if you end up pulling an all-nighter? Do you just
Right.
get a massive bonus based on that 20% differential?
That's a great question, and luckily the guidelines address that too. So overtime on a night shift is actually treated separately.
Oh, really? So it's not just lumped in with the night shift differential pay.
Right, there's a whole other set of rules for overtime pay in general.
Okay, so we're talking about different categories of extra pay, depending on the specific situation.
This is getting pretty complex.
Yeah, it's quite nuanced.
I know what you're thinking.
Yeah.
Where does all this money come from?
Right, right.
It's a valid question. All these extra payments must add up.
Well, both the law and the guidelines are pretty clear about how this is supposed to work. For national government entities, they initially have to use their existing budgets to cover these costs.
So they got to find the money somewhere.
Right. But going forward, the money specifically needed for night shift differential pay will be included in the annual General Appropriations Act.
Okay, so they're baking it into the budget, making it a permanent line item.
Exactly. So they've got a plan for the long term. But what about local governments? And those government-owned corporations, they don't all operate on the same budget as the national government, right?
That's right. And the guidelines acknowledge those differences. So for those government-owned corporations, think of them as companies that are owned and operated by the government, often providing essential services like transportation or utilities.
Mm-hmm.
They actually draw from their own corporate funds to cover night shift differential pay.
Interesting. So it's coming out of their own pocket, essentially.
Exactly. But for local governments, things are a bit different. They're required to use their own funds, separate from the national budget, to pay for this.
Okay, so different levels of government have different funding mechanisms in place. It's not just one big pot of money for everyone.
Right. It's more like a series of separate accounts, each with its own rules.
Got it. But even with all these details, I'm guessing this is just the tip of the iceberg.
You're catching on.
And
These are just the foundational guidelines. Think of them as like the blueprint. Each individual government agency will likely have their own internal procedures and guidelines building upon these rules.
So it's not just a one-size-fits-all approach. There's some room for interpretation at the agency level.
Exactly. They might have specific forms to fill out, different ways of tracking night shift hours, and even some flexibility in how they calculate the exact percentage of the differential.
So it's more like a framework that each agency can then tailor to fit their own specific needs and circumstances.
Exactly. They have the broad strokes laid out, but they get to color in the details.
Cool. So we've covered a lot of ground here, just on the government side of things.
So now we've got a pretty good handle on how this all works for government workers. But what about everyone else? What about all the folks working those late nights in the private sector?
Yeah, like, are we talking about the same kind of rules and regulations? What about someone working the graveyard shift at, like, a factory or a call center?
Well, it's definitely a different landscape. The Philippines, like many other countries, has a separate set of labor laws specifically for the private sector.
So there are laws about night shift pay for private companies.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's covered under what's called the Labor Code of the Philippines. You can kind of think of it as the main rule book for private sector employment.
Okay.
And within that code, there are specific provisions for extra pay for working during nighttime hours.
So is it similar to what we saw with the government employees?
Yeah.
Like, is there a specific formula or a minimum percentage?
There are definitely some parallels. For example, the labor code states that employees working between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. should receive a night shift differential of at least 10% of their regular wage.
10%. That sounds familiar. That's the same minimum we saw for public health workers in the government.
Exactly. It seems like there's some consistency across both the public and private sectors in terms of recognizing that working those late night hours deserves some extra compensation.
Yeah, it's like acknowledging that those hours can be tough on people, regardless of who they work for. But are there any other similarities, or is the private sector totally different?
Well, here's where things get a bit more, how should I say, flexible.
Okay.
Unlike the law for government employees, which is, very specific about who's eligible and how the pay is calculated, the labor code actually gives a lot of power to something called collective bargaining agreements.
Collective bargaining agreements. Now, that sounds like something to do with unions. Am I right?
You are. Unions play a big role in the Philippines in terms of shaping working conditions and night shift differential pay. Well, it's often a key point of negotiation in those agreements between workers and employers.
So it's not just about following a set of rules from the government. It's about workers having a say in how they're compensated.
Exactly. It can lead to better conditions for workers in industries where night shifts are common. But it also means that the specifics of how night shift pay works can vary a lot from company to company.
So it's not as standardized as in the government sector.
Right. It could even vary from industry to industry. So you might have a completely different system for calculating night shift pay at a manufacturing plant compared to, say, a call center.
Wow. So it's a bit more unpredictable?
Yeah, you could say that. It makes things a bit more dynamic.
Dynamic, okay. But are there any, like, general trends, or is it really just a free-for-all when it comes to night shift pay in the private sector?
Well, while there's definitely some variation, you do see some patterns emerge. For example, industries where night work is super common, like manufacturing, where you have production lines running 24/7, they tend to have more formalized systems in place for night shift differential pay.
Okay, that makes sense. If you've got tons of people working through the night, it's probably easier to have a clear system for handling their pay.
Right. It's about efficiency and consistency. And the same goes for those business process outsourcing companies, or BPOs as they're called. Yeah, they handle a lot of like customer service tasks and other stuff for companies in different time zones. So they often have pretty structured systems for night shift pay as well.
Makes sense. They're dealing with a global workforce, so they got to have clear guidelines. But what about smaller companies or those in industries where night work isn't as common? What do they do?
Well, even without a strong union presence or, well-established industry norms, companies are still required to follow the basic guidelines in the labor code. That means they absolutely have to provide that minimum 10% differential for night work.
Okay, so that's like the baseline.
Exactly. But anything beyond that, like how it's calculated, whether there are any additional benefits for certain types of night shifts and so on, those things might be more flexible and decided on a case-by-case basis.
So it's kind of like a sliding scale.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Larger companies in certain industries might have more structured systems, while smaller companies or those with less frequent night work might have a bit more leeway.
But that 10% minimum is the law, regardless.
Exactly. It's the non-negotiable part. And I think it's important to remember that all of this is still evolving. With the rise of remote work and the gig economy, those traditional boundaries of work, they're getting blurry.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like, what does night work even mean anymore when someone could be working remotely from a completely different time zone?
Exactly. These are the kinds of questions that policymakers and labor advocates are grappling with right now. It's like a whole new frontier in the world of work.
Wow. So we've gone from talking about specific laws in the Philippines to thinking about the global implications of changing work patterns.
It's all connected, really, and it shows how even something like night shift pay can open up a much bigger conversation about fairness and the future of work.
Totally. So we've laid out the landscape of night shift pay in the Philippines, from the public sector to the private sector, and even touched on the challenges of a more globalized workforce. But now I'm kind of curious about the human side of all this. Okay, so we're back. And I feel like we've covered a ton of ground already, understanding how the Philippines handles night shift pay for both government workers and those in the private sector. But now I want to kind of step back and think about the bigger picture. Like, why do we even have night work in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because the conversation about night shift pay, it's not just about the money, right?
Right.
It's about recognizing that there are people out there working all through the night, keeping things running while most of us are asleep.
Yeah, and those folks are making certain sacrifices, dealing with potential disruptions to their sleep, their family life, all that stuff.
Exactly. So understanding why night work exists helps us see the whole picture.
Okay, so, like, what are the main reasons we even have night work?
Well, for starters, think about all the things that just can't shut down at night.
Like,
Hospitals, right?
Yeah.
You need doctors and nurses on duty around the clock, emergency services, police, firefighters, paramedics. They got to be ready to go at any time.
yeah, those are essential services.
Exactly. And then you've got things like transportation. Imagine if all the trains and buses just stopped running at like 10 p.m.
Yeah, that wouldn't work.
Right. And then on top of those essential services, you've got a whole bunch of industries that are driven by global commerce, where time zones become almost irrelevant because companies are trying to squeeze out every hour of productivity.
Right, it's like a 247 economy now.
Exactly. And of course, you can't forget about the impact of technology. The internet never sleeps. And with remote work becoming more and more common, people can be working at any hour of the day or night from anywhere in the world.
It's true. I feel like work is just constantly blending into our lives now. It's not so clear-cut anymore.
Right. So it's this combination of necessity, globalization, and technology that has created a world where night work is just unavoidable in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what about the people who are doing this night work? What are the consequences for them?
Well, that's where things get a little more complex and potentially concerning because, we humans, we're not really designed to be up all night.
Right, we have those circadian rhythms, right?
Exactly. Our bodies have these natural sleep-wake cycles, and when we disrupt those cycles consistently, it can have some pretty negative effects.
Like what?
Well, the most immediate consequence is usually sleep deprivation,
Right. Yeah.
which can then lead to all sorts of problems.
Like feeling tired and groggy all the time.
Right. But it can also lead to more serious health issues in the long run. Things like increased risk of heart disease, diabetes, even some types of cancer.
Oh, wow. I knew pulling all-nighters in college wasn't good for me, but I didn't realize it could be that bad.
Yeah, it's not something to mess around with. And it's not just the physical health aspects either.
What do you mean?
Well, think about the social and psychological impacts of working nights. Night shift workers often have trouble maintaining a regular social life, participating in family activities, even just eating dinner with their loved ones at a normal time.
Yeah, it's like living in a different time zone from everyone else.
Exactly. And that can lead to feelings of isolation, stress, even depression in some cases. And it can be especially tough on parents who work nights.
Oh, I bet. Missing those school events and bedtime stories. That's got to be hard.
It is. And it's important to acknowledge that the burden of night work often falls disproportionately on certain groups within society. Studies have shown that women, minorities, and people with lower levels of education are more likely to be working night shifts.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah, and it raises some important questions about economic inequality. Like, who's really bearing the brunt of keeping this 24/7 society going?
It makes you think. If you're struggling to make ends meet, you might not have a lot of options, right?
Right. You might not be able to say no to a night shift job, even if you know it's going to be tough on your health and your family. And that's why policies like the ones we've been talking about, guaranteeing extra pay for night work, are so important.
I see. It's not just about making up for the inconvenience. It's about recognizing those systemic inequalities.
Exactly. It's about making sure that the people who are keeping our world running, even when it's dark outside, are treated fairly.
Right. And maybe it even goes beyond just the paycheck, right? Like maybe it's about providing more support for night shift workers in other ways.
Absolutely. Things like affordable childcare options that cater to non-traditional work schedules, or maybe more flexible work arrangements that allow night shift workers to have more time with their families.
Yeah, or maybe even investing in more research to understand the long-term health effects of night work and finding ways to minimize those risks.
Right. And maybe it's also about changing our cultural attitudes towards night work. Like, instead of seeing it as just a necessary evil, maybe we can start to appreciate and value the people who are doing those jobs.
Totally. It's like they're the unsung heroes of our modern world.
Exactly. And even though we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, We've really just scratched the surface.
Yeah, it's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too. And hopefully it's given you, the listener, some food for thought as well, because even though we've been focusing on the Philippines, a lot of these issues are relevant all over the world.
That's true. So, as we wrap up this episode, we just want to encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning about the world around you. Because even the most seemingly niche topics, like night shift pay, can lead to some pretty big insights.
Absolutely. And thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.